Okay, today's class is about cognitive load theory, which is basically a branch of psychology that studies um, learning under a cognitive perspective, especially applied to things like problem solving, things like how to develop skills at solving math problems, and so on. We're gonna give a deeper look into that. But before I talk about cognitive load theory, here are the memory competition results. So these are the rankings, and congrats for everybody who made to the top 3, and also congrats for everybody who participated. Thank you for sending the scores and all of that. So who here who participated and got in the top ranking? So we got like a few people here. So yeah, congrats guys, and congrats. Yeah, I was very impressed with the results. I actually saw very good results there, and I'm very proud of you guys. You did very well. So yeah, now about the class, the content of the class, cognitive load theory. So we saw deliberate practice. We saw how to develop skills if you want to become an expert at something, and that was very broad. It was like how to practice broadly, but now I'm gonna show another area that's also helpful if you want to become an expert at something, and more specifically to things like mathematics, coding, or things like that. Things are about applying something. And if you remember the first class that I divided knowledge in like memories, recalling factual knowledge, understanding conceptual knowledge, and then applying procedural knowledge, we have that this would be more useful for like applying procedural knowledge. So things like in the case of mathematics, it's about procedural knowledge. It's about applying a procedure, like solving a math problem, or coding is also about applying a procedure. So here we have a description of the types of memory. And here's basically for you to understand learning, it can also be helpful to understand how the mind works cognitively. So we have 3 types of memory. We have sensory memory, we have working memory, and we have long-term memory. Each one of those have their own subtypes. But I'm not going to go deeper into that. I'm not going to explain in detail. So I'm going to just give a sense of what each one of those is. So the sensory memory is not conscious. You're not aware of it, but it does exist. It's very short. It has a very short duration, and it's very broad. So basically, everything that your senses have contact with, it goes to your sensory memory for a very short period of time, and then usually it just goes away. Think about all the things. For instance, you don't right now. You probably don't know. You're not aware of how your left pinky feels. Like you don't know how it feels, but like the information is definitely there. It's just not in your consciousness. So that's basically sensory memory. Um, if the information is deemed by your mind, by your brain, important, then you're gonna have that in transfer to working memory, which is basically your consciousness. And here, the working memory, you can call it. It's also called short-term memory, but to call it working memory makes more sense because it's not just a space where you put stuff there. It also processes the information. So it stores the information for a short period of time. So you're going to have it, if you don't repeat it in your head, it's going to last from 15 to 30 seconds. And it has 7 minus or plus spaces, slots available, basically. So you can have from 5 to 9 elements, usually, for most people. And it doesn't change throughout time. You're not going to develop your working memory or anything. But really, it's basically everything you're aware of right now. And the thing is that because it's so short, you basically will forget things naturally after a very short period of time. And if you want to stick to that, you got to keep retelling that. You know when you try to learn a new phone number and you keep telling yourself the phone number, repeating over and over again? That process of repetition is basically what makes the memory stay there and get transferred to either stay in working memory or get transferred to long-term memory. And long-term memory is actually this memory that's huge, it's practically infinite. It can store pretty much more than you will ever need in your whole life. And it can last for a short period of time, or it can last like really forever, basically. But yeah, these are the three main types of memory we have. And the idea is that, let me see. So the idea is that the long-term memory stores information in schemas. And schemas, they're basically these structured, it's information stored in a structured way that's connected. So it's not just a list. Our memory doesn't work like a list. It's not as if you go to your memory, your long-term memory, there's like tons of lists. So for instance, if you tell me, imagine I tell you, I know, if I told you that I knew all the states of the US, and you asked me, okay, so tell all of them. It doesn't mean that I can recall all of them in a list, right? If you tell me that you know all the states in the US, it doesn't mean that you can recall all of them. If you tell me, I know all the capitals of all the states of the US, it doesn't mean that if I ask you, okay, name them all in alphabetic order. That's not in your head right now. You don't have that sorted in your head. So what you have is basically this web of associations in your head, and they're usually called schemas. So let's go move on to this idea here, this image that I think summarizes a lot of things very well. So we have here the input, and we have everything goes to sensory memory. Everything got to go in this order. Usually it's going to be forgotten. It's unlimited up to 3 seconds. Okay, you pay attention to that. It goes to working memory. Around 7 items for 5 to 20 seconds. Can vary a little bit more than that, but it's usually this. It's very short, basically. The idea is that working memory is everything we have to work with, and it's very short. It lasts for very little, and it can fit just a few things. And that's very crucial to understand, that we are limited and we cannot do anything about that in terms of it's not about developing your working memory, but learning is going to be more about this thing that I'm going to show later. So usually it's forgotten, but you can do rehearsal if you want to keep the thing in your working memory. You can keep repeating that to yourself over and over again. If you don't want to forget something, you can just keep repeating that. That's what we have inherently, like biologically, we just are born knowing that. We just keep repeating things, and that's how it usually works. And if the thing gets encoded into long-term memory, that's what we call encoding. Basically, information moves from working memory to long-term memory. And when we need that information back to use again, we have retrieval, which is the process of basically retrieving knowledge from long-term memory to working memory, because we only have this thing to work on. So as I told you, it's basically, working memory is basically your consciousness. And if you want to recall, if you want to use your knowledge, you need to first retrieve the knowledge from long-term memory to working memory. So if you studied something and that knowledge is in long-term memory, you don't have that in your awareness right now. You need to retrieve that so that it moves to working memory, and then you can use it. Okay. Any questions so far? No? Okay, so let's move on. Here, what is learning basically? It's basically developing schemas. So what I told you is that long-term memory stores these things that I'm not giving a clear definition, but I won't. But basically get this as a structured information, basically, a web of information. And the idea is that learning would be about developing schemas. It's about developing long-term memories. Okay, that would be what learning is about. And here, the idea is that I told you guys, working memory is very limited. It can fit around 7 items, usually. And that's very bad. Like, it's awful. That's very limited. However, there is one thing about this. When you have a schema and you retrieve it from long-term memory, that schema occupies a single unit of space in your working memory. So here's the thing. If you just got an input and it falls here in your working memory, that's one space. However, if you're retrieving from long-term memory, it's also going to occupy only a single space. One schema is going to occupy a single space. And the thing about schemas is that there are just these huge webs of information and connectivity. And what does that mean? So for instance, imagine when you were learning how to read. When you were learning how to read, you would read letter by letter, right? Every single letter was an independent component of the text that you needed to pay attention to. Okay? And you needed to store every single letter of a word so that you could read the whole word. You would go here, B-O-A-R-R-D, it's like, it's very difficult. You would need to store 5 things. For you to read the word board, you would need to store 5 things in your working memory. That's like almost all of your working memory. However, when you grow older, those letters, they become words more easily for you. And that goes to your long-term memory. And now you have you don't need to pay attention to every single letter, but now you have the whole word in your long-term memory in schemas. You have the word board associated to what it means. You have it associated to times you use the board. It has associated to its types. You have the counts of syllables. You have all types of things. You have images. You have tons of things associated to that. And now when you see this sequence of letters, you don't pay attention to every single letter. You don't. When you were learning how to write, you would pay attention to every single curve of it. When you're very young, you're paying attention to everything. Oh, this is a vertical stroke. This is like, no, it looks like it's a circle. But like now you look at it and it's like board. Okay, and that's because it's a schema, and it's gonna have very little. It's gonna, instead of occupying 5 spaces in your working memory, now it occupies just 1. And when you become a better reader, if you're fluent in English, what happens is that you don't read word per word. You're gonna actually get like these chunks of text. You're not gonna pay attention for like on an ability. You're like on an ability, like on and this like gets smushed into one single thing. You're not really paying attention to all of it. You grab like chunks of text when you read as you become more fluent. And this means that chunks of text become schemas and so on. So it gets even more and more efficient with time. So instead of having each word occupying a single space in your working memory, now you have tons of text, like bits of text, parts, phrases occupying a single space in your working memory. And now you become more effective, more efficient. So that's the power of learning. The idea is not that your working memory becomes better. It's not that your memory becomes better. It's just that you learn new things. And that improves efficiency a lot. But your working memory is still the same. So, any questions about this so far? About the increase in efficiency when we learn things? Did everyone understand what I mean? Now, and the cool thing about schemas is that it works through pattern recognition as well. And when we are talking about skills, math, like problem solving, chess is the example that I put here. We have that what gives this skill is the long-term knowledge. So one thing, when I was growing up, everyone I would talk to, and I think that's common here in the United States as well, everyone will have the impression that if you do something like solving the Rubik's Cube, or if you play chess, you're probably very smart, right? You're probably very intelligent. You have very good like critical thinking skills. You must be very, very intelligent. But the interesting thing about expertise in these areas, like chess, Rubik's Cube, or whatever, it's not really based on intelligence. And there's like very interesting research on this. But in a big summary, expertise in chess doesn't come from the critical thinking that's done while the grandmaster is playing. Like, it rather comes from prior knowledge than current thinking. So a grandmaster can play multiple games independently, simultaneously. Like, go here, sit with one person, play against this person, go to the next person, play with this. They don't need to keep track of the game previously. Rather, what happens is that a grandmaster has tons and tons and tons of hours of practice, deliberate practice, which is what we studied before. And all those patterns, they get encoded in long-term memory. And now when those board patterns show up, they can recognize that and retrieve the precise moves that would lead to a higher probability of winning. So all of that, for instance, when a grandmaster, if you give a grandmaster a chess configuration that was taken from an actual game, and you give like a sequence of chess configurations, a whole board with all the pieces, they can recall it very easily. Like, if you ask them, show them for a little time, then you remove it and ask them to recreate the board, they can do it very easily. But if you give like a random configuration of pieces on a board, chess pieces, randomly, that will not appear in an actual game, their memories of the configuration is as bad as a newbie's. And the reason is because it's not in their schema. So the schemas they have come from the past experience. If the game configuration, the chess configuration, does not appear in chess games, they don't have that under their schema. So it's like words. You can recall a phrase if I tell you, please recall like this phrase. You got to memorize this phrase. This skill is acquired slowly. If you need to memorize this is very easy. But if I show you like a sequence that's this long of random letters, that's really hard. Like, you're gonna be like, fuck, I can't. Like, what am I gonna, like, it's just 25 or something letters that's completely random. But when they form words, that's in your schemas. Okay, that's in your schema. And now you can recall it much more easily. So the idea is that real expertise in chess, mathematics, they're a feat of memory. It's not so much about critical thinking, in the sense that when it comes to like problem solving, okay, like in the case of math, it's not just solving problems, but it's like math competitions, for instance. It's a lot about having prior experience and knowing the strategies, tricks that have been applied before in such a way that now your schemas are effective in this current situation. Any questions about this? Okay. So the idea here for chess is that it's very common for people who are very smart to get interested in that when they're young, simply because, well, these rules are difficult for a child to learn. And kids who have have more ease to understand rules and things like that, they're going to perform better initially, and they're going to feel more encouraged to keep doing it. And then they gain more practice than their peers, and then they become better. And then there's like this tendency to feel like, oh, only smart people do this. When it's actually, well, only smart people become good at this. When it's actually, well, they were the only ones who were encouraged to begin with, from the beginning. But really, it's more about the number of hours and how effective the practice was. Any questions, or can I move on? Okay, I'll move on. Okay, and why am I talking about all of this? So I'll move on to one more thing about the theory, and then we're gonna give some examples of practical things that we could apply this to. So here, we have that our working memory is very limited. We have that our working memory is very limited. And we can speak of, of how things impose a weight on our working memory. We call this load, the cognitive load. And we have two types of cognitive load. We have intrinsic cognitive load, and we have extraneous cognitive load. And the cognitive load is basically that mental effort that you feel when you're studying. When you are studying something, oh, this is hard, you're trying to process the information, it imposes some load on your head. It literally feels like it's heavy. It feels like this mental pain, this mental effort that you're applying to learn something. So here we have an explanation of what the intrinsic cognitive load is. It's basically about the cognitive load that comes from the content itself. So it's how complex it is. It's dependent on what you're studying. So for instance, if you're studying a formula that's very complex, it has multiple elements, and they interact. It's their interaction, okay? It gives high cognitive load. Okay, makes it complex. The extraneous cognitive load is basically the things that come from outside the content itself, but it's about the medium that you're using to learn it. So things like the text is confusing, maybe there are distractions, maybe there is redundancy in the text that make, like, you gotta read it twice. You're like, oh wait, is it the same thing or is it something else? Why is it redundant? This is all extraneous cognitive load. It doesn't come from the content itself, it comes from the medium you're using to learn it. So these two things are different. Or the instructional tools that the professor, teacher, instructor is using. So their way of teaching, basically. All of those are extraneous cognitive load, and it's not good. That load doesn't help you with anything. It's really, the idea is that the extraneous cognitive load is really not something that you're looking for. And the like, there's always going to be some of it, but like, the little as little as possible is the better. But the intrinsic cognitive load, the higher the better, insofar as it doesn't go over your working memory capacity. Because as I told you, working memory is very limited, and if the cognitive load surpasses your working memory resources, you get a memory failure. And I'm gonna discuss more what that means. But basically, we want to learn as much as possible in as little time as possible, right? That's what we want. We want to be as efficient as possible. So this means that the idea is that the more connected the information is, the more complex the information is, and the more intrinsic cognitive load you're holding, it means you're learning more. You are learning more. However, you have your own limitations. So intrinsic cognitive load got to be optimized. Like, you got to go as far as you can, but you cannot surpass what you can, basically. Let me think. Okay. And here's what I talked about intrinsic cognitive load. Element interactivity is the idea that when you have multiple elements interacting, that's what gives the intrinsic cognitive load of the content. So when you have a formula, math formula, chemical formula, you cannot learn the formula by analyzing every single variable, every single number separately. If you read every single variable separately, you lose context of the whole thing. So one example with a word, as I told you, you can't interpret a word by looking at each letter separately. All of them, they gotta go together. And we can only read fast because they are all incorporated as schemas. But when you're learning something from beginning, like a formula, every single element, if you look at every single element separately, you can't comprehend the whole formula. You gotta understand what all of them mean and how they are playing together. In a chemical formula, you gotta understand, oh, this goes with this, and that causes a reaction that gives rise to that. But you can't look at every C and O and squared separately. You got to understand as a whole, and that's what, when element interactivity, that's what it is, what element interactivity is, and that's what gives rise to the cognitive load, because you got to hold all of that together at the same time, and all of that interacting. So that means that you're putting a lot of things, many things, at the same time in your working memory. And that occupies a lot of space, and we know the working memory is very limited. Any questions about this? Sure.
Is intrinsic
Yeah, learning in general. It's really broad. It's not necessarily in a. Yes, I don't think it's usually applied outside of learning. I've only studied about it under the context of learning. So yes, it's about learning. But maybe it could be applied to outside of learning. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it being applied outside of learning. Yeah, but yeah. Any other questions? If you have any questions, just let me know about this. Because now we're gonna talk about what I meant by a memory failure or memory overload. So if you have too much cognitive load, you're basically putting too many things in your working memory. There's a limit, a very small limit. You put too many things, you put too much load, your working memory can't. What happens? You have a memory overload, and that's when careless mistakes happen. So when you're applying something, when you're solving a problem, a math problem, when you're doing a question from an exam, and you do question by question, question after question, and maybe in one of those questions, you got to deal with a lot of things at the same time. You got to hold a lot of things at the same time. You do it, you do the problem solving, apply the formulas and all of that. And then after you get your grade back, you look at your grade, you're like, wait, I got that thing wrong. And you go to look at it and you missed something very obvious. And you're like, how can I be so dumb? How did I forget this? You know, this was so obvious. This is so easy. Why did I forget this? Why did I not understand this? And usually it's because of this. Very often, careless mistakes are not because of attention. So we tend to think that careless mistakes are because of lack of care, in the sense that, well, careless mistakes because I did not give enough care, I didn't pay attention. But sometimes careless mistakes are actually because you were being careful with many things, too many things. And if you go over your working memory, if you're trying to pay attention to more things than your working memory can hold, something needs to leave so that something else can come in. This means that you're gonna skip something in your working memory for something else to come. And this means that that's when you're gonna basically, well, make a mistake. And of course, if it's a careless mistake because you were not paying attention, because you were sleepy or something like that, really the solution is just, well, you got to pay more attention. But clearly, like drink a coffee or something. But for this, it's not about drinking a coffee. It's not about being awake. It's really, there were too many things for you to look after. So here are some solutions, some tips that I'm offering here. Under this slide, this idea that, well, we have this working memory, these limited resources, how can I avoid careless mistakes? So how many of you have been through this? Like, I knew this, but I made a mistake. You know, like everyone has felt this once in their lives. So one thing you need to pay attention to is also your own cognitive resources. How much you're struggling with something as you're going through it. Like you're doing a test or you're trying to solve a problem, you're doing a problem set or something. And there's a point that you're struggling. That mental effort, it's like, that's good, but you also need to be aware that you can't just keep track of everything in your head. And then we come to the second thing. It's like, you can always write things down, and you can always recheck your work afterwards if you wrote it down. So like writing your information down in an organized manner is instead of holding everything in your head. Some people can be a little bit stubborn, like, oh no, I'm gonna just do everything in my head. Very often there is no benefit in that. If you're already at your limit, there is no point in doing that. You can always write things down and check it back again later, or highlight things and check it again at the end. And another interesting thing is that, you guys remember what I talked about when I was saying that when we learn and send knowledge to long-term memory, they become schemas, and then they become much more efficient when we bring it back to working memory. So instead of having 5 things in your working memory, you have just one schema in your working memory. This is very efficient. And where does that can be very effective here, because if you're having trouble with careless mistakes, very often careless mistakes, they go away with practice. If you're a newbie at something, you're going to make a lot of careless mistakes. It's much more likely for you to make careless mistakes, simply because since you're a newbie, you're going to have many things to store in your working memory at the same time. And as you become more acquainted with that, that goes to your long-term memory as a schema. And now when you retrieve it from long-term memory, it goes as a single chunk to your working memory. So it occupies much less space in your working memory now that you're like more knowledgeable in that. So usually, for instance, if you're having trouble with mental math and you make careless mistakes in mental math, if you get more practice with mental math and you work specifically on that, with time, you're not going to be holding as many details when you're doing mental math. You're not going to be, the frequency of careless mistakes is going to decrease, usually. Any questions about this? Of the idea behind it? It's basically, if you're having a memory overload, you just unload your memory. Basically, you write things down. And I think this is a very interesting insight of cognitive load theory, the idea that careless mistakes are not lack of care, usually. I think that's a very interesting insight of this. So that's why I wanted to show you guys. Can I move on? Okay. I have a question for you guys. I'm showing you guys 2 teaching strategies. On one side, here, imagine this is like for someone who's learning algebra. You know, they're elementary school, they're learning basic algebra, and the goal is that we're trying to teach them how to leave a variable isolated in one side of the equation. So one teaching strategy would be to just go to students and show who don't have prior experience with that, and just give them tons of examples and try to teach them by examples. And another strategy would be, well, I can show them just like one example and just give them exercises as soon as possible. As soon as I explained it, or maybe just explain the process and give them to solve it on their own. Like explain how to do it, then just give them exercises and exercises and exercises and tell them to do it on their own. So on one side, we have examples, many, many examples, and then we have an explanation and exercises, 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 exercises. What strategy do you guys think is better? So on one side, examples. Raise your hands if you think that showing a ton of examples, it would be better for learning in the initial stage. Okay. How many people here think that giving them exercises as soon as possible up front is better for learning? Raise their hands. Is that okay? How many people? Okay. So, I think some people did not raise their hands, right? Okay. We got a tie, but like, interesting. The answer is in the title of this slide, the work example effect. So after a lot of research, we found that teaching, this teaching strategy of just give people exercises to solve, and they're gonna learn by doing on their own. You know, they're gonna learn by doing it on their own, because they gotta struggle and they gotta find out on their own how to solve things, how to apply those things. It turns out that this is not the best way of teaching beginners on any content. The best way of teaching someone who doesn't have prior experience is actually showing really many examples. this is what's called the worked example effect. And the reason why this is really at the core of cognitive load theory is because this can be predicted from the theory that I just taught you guys. It's the idea of the difference between intrinsic cognitive load and extraneous cognitive load. The thing is that the cognitive load that a child is going to feel, or a student or a college student is going to feel when trying to solve the problem on their own, that's really extraneous. The cognitive load of trying to produce a new solution to something, to a problem, and try to think of all possible ways of reaching somewhere, that's extraneous. That comes from the way the professor is teaching them. But it doesn't come from the content itself. and and this cognitive load, it does not help the learning of the student. So the worked example effect happens by removing this cognitive load. We can show the child straight away how to solve it and give them examples. Of course, we can't just show them examples, but we got to show them a ton of examples, basically. Many more than are usually shown. But notice that I'm being very explicit here that this is about novices. So when you're a beginner, you need many more examples for things to learn them. And the reason why I'm being very specific with this is because we do have a plot twist later on. Because for a beginner, okay, it's better for us to have tons of examples rather than being explained and just giving exercises. It's better to actually be explained and show solutions of problems. So you see a math theorem for the first time in your life in an area that you're not really familiar with. You should be given examples, not just explain and apply, solve on your own. Actually, examples and examples and examples. But the plot twist is that we have this cool thing called expertise reversal effect, which is the idea that when you become more knowledgeable on things, if you're reading solutions to problems, that becomes redundant. Because when you become an expert, and here the word expert means something different from what I was using, what I meant when we talked about deliberate practice. Here, expert means someone who has prior experience on something. It doesn't really mean an actual expert as we usually talk in common speech, but it's really just to make a comparison between novice and expert. So basically, someone who has no prior experience in that, no prior knowledge that's helpful, and someone who has prior knowledge and experience that's helpful for them. What happens is that when you become more experienced, what happens is that seeing solutions to a problem that you could solve on your own, and you already have in your head a schema that helps you solve that problem. When you look at that problem, you kind of have the feeling of, oh, I kind of know how I could solve this. I kind of know how I could approach this problem. And then you read the solution, and it's something different from what you were thinking. And now you gotta accommodate this new solution with your solution, and now you gotta match both. And that becomes extraneous cognitive load again. So what happens is that when you're a novice, you don't have that prior schema. So you're not trying to compare and associate. You're not having this conflict of the instructor's solution and your own solution. But as you become an expert, as you get prior experience, you get this schema of your own, and now their solution starts to conflict with yours, and that generates cognitive load again. So the idea is that for an expert, for someone who has prior experience on something, if they're learning a theorem, if they're learning a problem-solving strategy, it's better for them to solve it on their own. It's better for them to try to solve the problem on their own. And then there's going to be more learning than not. And then if they just read solutions. So if you're learning math, let's say you're learning calculus, it's better at the beginning, it's better for you to have a lot of examples, a lot of, if you're learning integration, basically. You're trying to learn strategies of integration. And it's better at the beginning for you to learn with a ton of examples, a lot of examples of how to solve things. But after a while, when you see an integral that is similar to what you have already seen before, and you already feel confident that you can solve that, you should solve that on your own. If you're not learning any new strategies, any new tricks, if you're not learning anything new after reading this new example, if you feel like I read this example and I didn't learn anything, that's really because it's already time for you to do things on your own. It's already the moment that you should be trying to do things on your own. But usually it takes much longer to move to this new stage than people usually presume and textbooks presume. Usually you're going to have like one example, two examples. And very often, maybe you would need like 10. And that's fine. Any questions so far? Okay. We'll move on. So we have that novices need examples. Experts need problem solving. How do we move from one to the other in a more smooth way? Because am I going to do just a ton of examples and then I do a ton of problems? How could I do it? Like, is there any smooth transition? There is one transition that's interesting that you could do it. You could just do a ton of examples and then do problems on your own. But there is a way to do like a smooth transition. And that's called the problem completion effect. Basically, when you're reading a solution, when you're reading an example or a solution, you can also hide parts of the solution. And that's basically a problem completion. A completion problem is basically a partially solved problem. And some blanks are left for the reader to fill in. Here's an example of this. So a student that's learning basic algebra, they're going to be reading it. They're going to go here. They're not given this end of the solution. So now they need to do the last move here. This is a little bit harder than just giving the whole thing. So this is like one step further in difficulty, than just showing them the whole thing from before, than showing the whole solution. So one way of applying this to textbooks that haven't been, let's say, they haven't been thoughtful of this teaching method, let's say, and you want to apply it, you want to apply it more effectively, you want to do make your studies more efficient. One way is basically you go to the solutions, and at first you read the solutions as a whole, to the problems as a whole, and you keep reading less and less of the solutions incrementally. So you stop reading like the last part of the solution, like the last step, then you stop reading the solution from the second to last step. You keep hiding more and more from the solutions, and then you get to a point that you're really doing the whole thing on your own. And then you move from like doing everything. So you moved from a novice to an expert, basically. And the reason why I'm showing these things is because this is much more time efficient. Reading solutions and learning from solutions is much faster, gives you a much higher advantage when you're a novice over someone who is trying to learn by doing things completely on their own at first. If you go and try to learn, if you go and have an instructor or professor who's like, for you to learn this, you got to do it on your own, and they just explain to you and just give a ton of exercises, you're going to take very, very, very long to find out a strategy, a trick that you could learn by reading one single example. So this is a much more effective and efficient way of learning, basically. You do a ton of worked examples, and you keep moving further and away from them as you need less and less of that instruction. But since here we're talking, this is more of something that you've got to be aware on your own of, like, how much instruction do I need? It's really a lot. There needs to be a lot of self-awareness in this. So I'm showing you guys these ways of learning so that you can pay attention to that when you're studying on your own. Here, I'm going to show another effect. Any questions before I move to this? Okay. So now I'm going to show the variability effect. This is the idea that if you have a ton of examples or a ton of problems that are similar, you're going to learn less than if they're very varied. Or if you're learning a ton of examples, a ton of problems, and you do by chunk, like blocked practice. Now I'm going to do 10 problems of this type. Now I'm going to do 10 problems of this type. Now I'm going to do 10 problems of that other type. This is less effective than doing, I'm going to do one problem. I'm going to do 30 problems that's randomly selected from these. So one time I'm going to be doing from this, then that one, and I would never know which type of solution it is. That's the variability effect. If you don't know how to solve it by just staring at the problem, or just because, oh, this is a problem from this section of the book, so I know I got to use this theorem. That's interesting, right? We learn in textbooks by going, we read the whole section, and then there are like the problems. And in the problems, you know how to solve it. Like, you know the theorem you got to apply to the problem. You know, you're kind of already told what you got to do because of the section. But if you have a random selection of those questions, it's much harder. And that's why exams tend to be harder, because usually the professor is not going to tell you, you got to apply this theorem. Sometimes the professor is nice and tells you, but like in real life, you're not going to be told that. And that's when the variability effect kicks in. It's if you actually learned in a way that's varied and it's random, you can't predict how you should solve it. That requires much more intrinsic cognitive load from you. That's much harder to do, but the learning tends to be better. So insofar as that extra cognitive load does not surpass your working memory, you're good to go. That you're going to have a better learning. If you can randomize the questions. So here's the idea. It's not about just doing, I'm going to do one question of this type, one question of this type, and one question of that type. It's not about doing one after the other. It's really about not knowing what type of question it is beforehand. Like, you really don't know. You try to solve it, and you don't know. You got to figure it out on your own. If you just do like, I'm going to do one of this, one of that, one of that, you can already guess, oh, I did one of that type. Now this one must be of that type. So now you already know again. So this really requires some randomness, basically. Any questions? This is similar to something I talked about like previously, like interleaving. I talked about that before as well in the deliberate practice class, I think. Okay. Now, the self-explanation effect, and that's the last effect I'm going to talk about. This is one method that can be used, especially for experts, in the sense that you already have prior experience, you already studied that before. Again, in this class, I'm not using the word expert in the same way we usually use, or in the same way we used last lecture. It just refers to someone who has knowledge that can be relevant to this context, basically. Who has prior knowledge that can be useful to solving a current problem. Here, we have the self-explanation effect, which is the idea that if you're an expert, besides doing problem solving on your own, you can learn by explaining examples, by explaining not in a surface level, but deeply, in the sense that you can take a solution from a textbook, a solution to a problem, and explaining that solution to yourself in terms of rules, in terms of when this happens, it's usually a problem of this type. When this happens, usually I should do this and that rather than that and that. The idea of the recognition of the patterns, the triggers they should look for, the cues they should look for in order to solve that problem. Basically, having a deeper explanation of the solution of that to that problem is in itself a way of learning. It's in itself a method to study. So that's an alternative to problem solving on your own, basically. You can just try to solve the problem on your own, but you can also study other solutions. That's also a way of learning. And that's also a way of learning that's effective for experts rather than novices. And now I have a question at the end. Which method from the course does this most closely resemble? I talked about a method that's very similar to this idea of the self-explanation effect. I talked about it in the understanding class, the class about how to understand things. And it was the Feynman technique. Do you guys remember the Feynman technique? It's the idea of teaching yourself the content in order to understand. So you try to, if you want to understand a concept or understand something, you can just explain that to yourself as if you were teaching someone. We have a very similar concept. You're explaining to yourself someone else's solution, and that in itself generates the learning. Any questions about this one? This can be applied to like solutions to math problems. It can be applied to lead code questions in case you're into programming. It can be applied to solutions to economics problems, like if you're studying some econ class, you can apply that. So basically any problem solving.
Sure. So if you're looking at like how like a certain topic that you want to understand and you just explain it to yourself in your own words, that's what this is?
Kind of, but it's not just about explaining how to do it, but also trying to figure out the cues that you should be looking for to reach the same conclusion that the problem solver did. So if you were on your own, what things should you have paid attention to so that you could have solved that on your own? Like every time you see this x2 squared in this position, it usually means that it's a problem of this type rather than the other type. So it's basically how you can, what are the things you should notice if you were alone that would lead you to the right solution? So what are the right cues to look after? And that's usually how your explanation is going to go. It's basically you're formulating these rules and structures of how to solve things. Do you get what I mean? Any other questions? Okay. Now, big summary. First of all, learning is painful. There is cognitive load. If there's no cognitive load, there's no learning. If it's easy and chill and light, you're probably not learning. If there's too much, it's also not gonna be good. And what matters the most is the type of cognitive load. If it's extraneous cognitive load, it really doesn't matter. If it's intrinsic cognitive load, in the sense that it comes from the content itself, it's not just because your back hurts because you're like sitting awful. Like it's really because of the content. It's intrinsic cognitive load. That's usually good. And so far as it doesn't surpass it, insofar as it doesn't surpass your cognitive ability, it's fine. And it's good. If it's not hard enough, you can always make it more complex, make it harder, and increase variability. If it's getting too easy, you're reading solutions to problems. You're feeling, okay, this is getting easy. You got to do it on your own. You got to move on to solving the problems on your own. It's still, you can still increase the difficulty. If it's still easy, you can still increase the difficulty. You can look for increasing the variability. Maybe I should look for solving these problems randomly rather than knowing how to solve it. maybe I should take harder problems rather than the easier ones. So basically, you want to leave it, you want to make sure that there is cognitive load, and learning needs to be painful in that sense. There needs to be effort in cognitive load there. And here we have, if there is too much load, we have careless mistakes. And this idea that novices learn from examples and experts learn from problem solving. Any questions? Now, the last class is next week. I'm going to cover test taking skills. I'm going to cover test taking for both exams in college and school overall, and strategies to implement during the tests that can improve your performance. I think that can be helpful since we're approaching finals. I think it would make sense for the last class to be about test taking skills, and also test taking skills for like standardized testing. So how to plan your studies for things like MCAT, LSAT, GRE, things like that, and how you can plan your studies around that, and how to look for data and how to plan that using ideas that we learned from the deliberate practice class and also from this one about cognitive load theory. And that's all. If you guys have any question, I will stay here wrapping up everything. But yeah, thank you a lot for coming and have a good week.